ago with the head of Gazprom from Russia, which is their big producer, and the minister from Algeria. And coming out of that talks, we saw oil markets firm a little bit. So there are discussions going on about what to do about the overproduction, the world overproduction. And I think it was encouraging with the new king in Saudi Arabia that he kept Al-Nami on as Saudi oil ministry, or minister. So we'll continue to have a little bit of information coming out of there and some stability in terms of Saudi Arabia's actions in the oil markets. Last thing I wanted to talk about was, some of the stuff on the federal side. We're still seeing talk about the waters of the U.S. and the redefinition of that. And over at the Capitol building, you see the legislature working on that issue. House Bill 1432 and House Continuing Resolution 3009 both address that. And the way the legislature is looking at it is they need to set up some type of an advisory council that works on these federal regulatory issues and has money available for litigation, mitigation, whatever they might need to spend money on in order to avoid the largest negative impacts that might come out of a waters of the U.S. definition or a new endangered species listing or something like that. So a lot of activity over at the Capitol building. We've been tracking almost 60 bills, 27 of them directly impact the agency. And we're starting to see now this week action on a lot of those bills and a fair number of them going away. So with that, I guess December was a tug of war. We had declining oil prices, we had increased spending, increased completions, increased production, and but the rig count and the oil price were going down. So I'll take questions.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is typical, but yesterday I was looking at sort of the list on your website of the active drilling rigs and where they're going next, and some of them said stacked, but a lot of them said undetermined. Is that something that has come up recently, or is that kind of typical from the past few years of not really knowing where their next spot is, or is that something to do with prices?
Good observation, and that is pretty typical. The question was on our website, on the drilling rig, we try to indicate where their next job is going to be or where they're going to move to. And we've seen over the last year a huge increase in the number that say undetermined. And a lot of that has to do with the multi-well pad drilling. So I don't think I have not noticed an uptick in people saying undetermined. It just, a lot of times until they finish the wells or all the wells on that pad, they don't really know where they're going. So I don't think that's a signal of a big number of rigs being idled or stacked.
With the prices bottoming out and very gradually recovering at this point, do you have some more confidence that the large trigger won't get hit?
There is. The question was, with the price bottoming out and beginning to rise, what's the thoughts about the big trigger? As you know, we hit the small trigger. I think we're seeing increased confidence that the large trigger is likely not to hit. I know that the legislature is dealing with a revenue forecast that includes the large trigger. It does include it for a pretty short period of time, but it includes the large trigger. I think the way prices are headed, it's looking more and more likely that the large trigger will not hit, and that when we do revenue forecasts in March and we start looking at the second half of the session and what kind of spending state government can do, we'll have a different picture.
Okay. We talk a lot about needing pipelines to reduce flaring. The 1.8-mile pipeline route on Fort Berthold, is there any truth that One Oak is abandoning and installing that pipeline?
Yeah, One Oak confirmed that they have abandoned that project. So there's about 40 million cubic feet a day in the southwestern part of Fort Berthold Reservation that's stranded because of that project, and they have abandoned that pipeline. They don't see any way to get that through the Figure 4 Ranch or through the Long X Forest Service lands. And so they're looking at a reroute they're actually looking at a new gas plant in northwestern Dunn County, and then a high-pressure line from that plant, along with a natural gas liquids line from that plant over to the Badlands plant and to Lonesome Creek so that they can move the gas out of the state. So they have walked away from that project, and they're looking at a complete reroute, which will obviously put it off for a year or more. That project potentially could have debottlenecked southwestern Fort Berthold in 15. That's not going to happen probably until third quarter 16 or maybe even into 17. So it's going to be a pressure point, certainly, for us on gas capture.
What about that there was another section that was?
The other section is looking a lot more promising. That is the Hawkeye compressor to Lake Sakakawea, and that is U.S. Corps of Engineers land. They approved the cultural study, and so Hess is pretty confident that they're going to get that permit and be able to do that pipeline this construction season. It's still bottlenecked. There's about 50 million cubic feet a day that's tied up behind that, but it looks like they're going to get that in place late this year. And they did go ahead and reconfigure their Hawkeye compressor station already in January, I believe it was, December or January. They did that work, anticipating they're going to get that line. So we think that one will be done probably third quarter of this year. That will help a lot.
Okay, let me take one from the webinar here. You mentioned some legislation. Could you briefly talk about the bill to separate the department's roles, and then also in terms of the department's funding needs? Are we going to get enough bucks to do our job?
Two separate bills. At 10 o'clock, I'll be back over there talking about House Bill 1014, which is our budget. And we were over there yesterday. The House Appropriations Subcommittee was looking at funding the most critical needs that we had for full-time equivalent positions or added positions, and then a package of contingency positions that would be based on either not hitting the big trigger or when the big trigger came off. And so that's the philosophy that they're following. So it looks like even on the most conservative side, they're looking at funding the most critical needs, which would be about 15 positions for the department. We'll have to do a little more talking about the core library because it's not currently in that package. Looking at the separation of functions within the department, as you know, that came out of Senate Energy and Natural Resources with a do not pass. And that's going to be on the floor this afternoon. So I never like to predict exactly what's going to happen on the floor of the Senate or the House over there. So there will be probably a pretty good debate on that this afternoon with regards to what was behind that bill and what the final outcome will be. Our expectation is that after looking at it and weighing all the inputs, it was interesting that Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission actually sent their executive director up here to testify against the bill. That is where the language came from in 1953. And we are one of 6 states that have that language in our code verbatim. There are another 11 states that have it in there, but it's kind of scattered around. It isn't exactly verbatim as you read it in the North Dakota Century Code. So expectation is that it will be left the way it is, but we're in for an interesting debate this afternoon on the Senate floor.
Emily, could you talk about what's going on with this exploration well in Emmons County?
Yes, thank you very much. The question was about the exploration well in Emmons County. Some mixed signals on this well. One is that they're very encouraged by the geology. Looks like there's about 80 feet of net pay in the well. But again, a tug of war. Natural gas prices have fallen along with oil prices, and so the economics are marginal at best on this well. And along those lines, I think increasing evidence that they have some real doubts about the economic viability of that play right now is they've canceled the other 3 permits. So there were 4 permits in total for Emmons and McIntosh County. They drilled this one well. The geology looks very good. The gas prices look very bad. And the economics must be pretty marginal because they canceled the other 3 permits.
Okay, back to legislation. Any thoughts on legislation limiting the time producers can flare? Any thoughts on if those bills will pass?
Well, there were 2 bills introduced, and one was defeated, and the other has been what's called hog house amended, to where the amendments to the bill don't talk about flaring at all. And so although it was introduced as a flaring bill, it has been amended and will likely be coming to the floor as a bill about fiscal notes on industrial commission orders. And so I think increasing limits on flaring is essentially off the table for the legislature and is going to remain the job of the industrial commission. There's a fair amount of pressure to relax those goals on the part of the industrial commission, but there is no hard evidence or information at this point that would lead me to make that recommendation to the commission.
Speaking of that, the flaring goals for next month, about 1% off. I think at this point, we think you guys will be able to make that next month. Can you just kind of explain,
Yeah, the question was having to do with gas capture and flaring goals. January production has to reach 77%, and December hit 76%. So it was 1% shy. I've met with a handful of companies during the month of December and January, and they were all able to achieve well in excess of the 77%. They struggled in November and December to reach the 74%. So we're pretty confident that January is going to come in above that 77%. It is going to mean some reduced oil production in order to get there. And it has meant an enormous increase in the number of well site liquids gas processing, those little mini plants, so to speak. I think we started this whole process in October with maybe 1 or 2 dozen of those in the field, and we're well in excess of 200 now. So lots of those little mini gas capture plants out there in the field. And along with that, at least one company has indicated that they've got about 5,000 barrels a day choked back in order to achieve the goals. So I think we're going to get to the goals, but there's some sacrifices in order to get there.
As a quick follow-up, now that first benchmark's been met and people kind of know the system now, know the game now, are they pretty confident being able to do what needs to be done at this point? Do they have a pretty good understanding of how to follow through on this at this point?
Yeah, the question was, are operators getting some understanding of how to get to the goals without requiring some type of regulatory action? And I think we're seeing a lot of that. I've had 3 companies talk about the fact that they're self-restricting or they're restricting their own production so that they don't end up on the list of you must restrict these wells, and also lots and lots of orders for these little plants, as well as a lot of discussion. Everybody I've met with in December and January has been talking to the gas gatherers on a weekly basis about line loopings and 2015 projects and compression and gas gathering line hydraulics and all these fun engineering terms. But they're talking on a weekly basis with their gas gatherers. So yeah, I think they're figuring out how to get there. And the company I met with yesterday, their projections show them being able to make that 85% goal by January 1 of 16, even though they've got 5 rigs running and a very active development program. They're working with their gas gatherer every single week on how to debottleneck and how to get that gas into the system. So.
Have we noticed an impact of the small trigger on completion?
It's too early to tell with regards to the impact of the triggers on completions. The small trigger hit February 1, and I will say this, the company that I met with yesterday said that they have a backlog of uncompleted wells, and so they had made some calls thinking that with the declining oil price and all of this backlog of completed wells, that there would be frac crews available, and they can't find one. So that's the first indicator that I had that companies are responding to that, and that the completion crews are running 100% at this point. So too early to tell. It'll be a month or two out before we can really see in the completed well data and the backlog data what the impact of that was. But that was an interesting thing to find out from them, that they personally, that company has 40 wells backlogged on completion, and they had made some calls looking for frac crews, and there were none available.
That's all of these companies are kind of waiting for oil service companies to drop the prices, but it doesn't sound like they're going to if they've got the work.
Yeah, the response was, oil companies have been looking to contractors or service providers to drop prices. And, this may be one area where they're not going to see much price relief. If the crews are running 100%, it's going to be hard to convince them to cut prices. I think there are, probably some other areas, roustabout crews and, maybe the proppant, the sand itself, and some of those areas where they can cut prices. But you're right. It's going to be very difficult to convince the frac people that they should cut prices when they've got all their crews working.
Emily, how are you doing with hiring pipeline inspectors?
We hired one. So the question was, how are we doing on hiring pipeline inspectors? We actually were able to fill one of those positions, which is pretty exciting for us. And my field supervisor tells me that he had a fantastic interview with a really experienced pipeline inspector person who is at the point in life where they would like to move out of the hectic pace of industry into a more stable hourly work environment with the state. So a pretty promising lead on the second one. That's not great news. I mean, we've had those positions available since July, and we've only filled 1 out of 3, but we are starting to see, with some of the slowdown and the winter months and the anticipation that we're going to drill less wells, connect less wells this coming year, we're starting to see an increase in applications for all of our inspector positions. That's encouraging.
Due to the drop in oil price, this actually might be a better question for Justin, but I'll throw it out there for you. Any indication that infrastructure projects are being delayed or dropped because of oil prices?
No indication of that at all. The midstream companies, I've had phone calls with 2 pure midstreamers who are on the gas and oil side in the last week, and then a couple of meetings late December with some gathering and processing people, and they are not reducing their capital budgets for gathering and midstream and processing at all. In fact, Hess is one of the major ones, and they have reduced their capital spending from $2.2 billion to $1.8 billion, but all on the drilling side. They are still going to spend as much money as they originally had planned on the gathering and processing side. So this will be a great opportunity for some catch up to happen.
Okay, the ever famous crystal ball question. With all the factors at play with rig counts and operators mentioning rigs being idled, what's the outlook for oil production moving forward in the next few months and through the summer?
Well, I meant to say this at the very beginning. It's encouraging to top that 1.2 million barrel a day number, because that gives us a good, solid foundation for the revenue projection that they're operating on right now. They projected 1.2 million barrels a day through the biennium, and now we've got the support of that, and we've got the backlog of 750 uncompleted wells to bolster that. So, you know, of course, it all depends on oil price and rig count. Oil prices are beginning to recover. Rig count is still going to go down a little bit, I think, between now and spring. And so in the short term, probably maintain production at a little over 1.2 million barrels a day. Maybe next year, we'll actually start to grow production again, significant growth in production. But I think with all of the forces at play here, a lot of companies aren't exactly sure what to do because they've got the little trigger. Are they going to get the big trigger? What is the oil price going to do? And do they really need to complete that well right now? And how will that fit with gas capture goals? So there is a lot of circular discussion going on within oil company management about what to do with their wells.
Okay, we're running up against the time crunch. I've got 2 questions on here that are borderline off topic. So if there are questions that are on topic.
Excuse me?
Can you give us an update on Savannah and where they are in getting that connected?
Yeah, the question was an update on Savannah, and my apology, I don't have that. I promised that I would have one for the commission the end of this month, and I just didn't get that done. So I don't know enough to give you an update on where they're at. That's the Springbrook plant, right? The one east of Williston where the commission granted some relief. I will have that information for the commission meeting. So just a little encouragement to come. I should mention one exciting thing that looks like it's going to happen. The province of Nova Scotia has a potential shale play, and their regulatory people are going to come visit us in February here and attend our hearings, sit down and talk with staff about how we regulate hydraulic fracturing, and also plan to attend the Industrial Commission meeting. So another state or province that wants to come and learn from our experience, see how we've managed what we're doing.
Are low oil prices affecting activity on Fort Berthold Reservation any differently than off?
That's a good question. The question was the effect of activity on Fort Berthold versus off. And we don't see any evidence of a difference yet at this point. So the overall statewide rig count is down 37%, and it's down just about the same amount on Fort Berthold. The wells waiting on completion is 750 statewide, and I had the number in my head, 165 on Fort Berthold. So it's almost just a small, what would you say, a subset of the statewide numbers. Don't see any difference at this point. So I think the administration at MHA Nation has shown some stability, and I think companies have been encouraged by that. And so it looks like even in gas capture, it's hard to see any difference between on and off.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to take these last 2 questions, and that's actually, there's one more, so we'll try to squeeze them in. But you were quoted earlier this week talking about due to low oil prices, some operators may feel like they need to cut corners. Can you elaborate on that? And why are you pushing on enforcement on something that has not yet happened?
Well, let me start by saying pushing enforcement probably isn't the right term to use on it. It's more a matter of making sure our field inspectors are aware. And so I put that information out there, and we got it out to the districts and to the local field inspectors through the field supervisor to just make them aware of some of the conversations that we were hearing. And a lot of it comes from a few oil companies that we visited with, some in person, some on the phone, who said that they were actually not renewing any of their contracts, that they were canceling whatever contracts that they could and telling their service providers that they wanted them to rebid and that they were looking to cut costs. And one result of that was that quite a few service providers with less experience were getting the work. They were bidding lower and they were getting the work. And And we even see that in the gas capture area with the well site units. The conversation with the operators is that the one company tends to come in low bidder, but they seem to be kind of understaffed and struggle to get the equipment up and running and keep it running. So we're seeing it a little bit in all areas, and just based on that information, thought it was important to get that news out to the field inspectors so they could be watching for inexperienced people or low bid type work performance.
Okay. Any thoughts on if oil conditioning has impacted production at all?
At this point, no impact on production, but lots and lots of questions. I spent an hour and a half yesterday answering 3 pages of questions from both my field inspectors and from operators about the details of how to implement the vapor pressure tests and where those were supposed to be taken. And what about, one good example was a 40-year-old Bakken well that just flows into a tank, doesn't even have a treater. What do they do to sell that oil? And so we have to come up with a way for them to condition that tank of oil. They end up with a tank once a month or maybe every other month that they have to sell, but that oil has to be conditioned. And so how can they go about that on a very old marginal producer that doesn't necessarily have all the equipment on site to perform that process? So folks are really getting ready for that, but no impact yet at this point, just dozens and dozens of questions.
Okay, and last question here, and you pretty much touched on it, so maybe just a recap, but has the drop in rig count or slow production growth helped with meeting flaring reduction goals?
I think it has. I think the backlogging of wells to be completed and the slowdown in rig count has given companies some breathing room to be able to achieve gas capture goals more easily. They just don't have as many rigs to look after, as many completions to worry about, and so the scheduling of those is quite a bit easier. Although the company I met with yesterday, they were pretty frustrated because the gas gatherer had promised that a line loop was going to be there, and they completed all the wells on a pad, and it didn't get there. And so had they known that was going to happen, they would have actually completed all the wells on a different pad. And that's going to happen, that sort of confusion and miscommunication. But I think it's on the rare side.
All right.
Yeah, it has helped.
All right, we're at 9:31, so
Thanks, everyone.
we're done. Mr. Kringstad, off on us. Oh, yeah. This one?
All right, perfect. Good morning. Justin Kringstad with the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. I'll be fairly brief this morning. There's a whole lot of the same as far as when we took a look at some of the transportation dynamics. So we'll just get going on the crude oil production. Again, very little change on the other 2 states, and you heard the update from North Dakota from Lynn. On the overall transportation breakdown, exact same percentage figures from November to December. So again, no real big change on the overall dynamics of crude oil transportation out of the region. On slide 4, again, taking a look at where the Brent WTI spread has been, taking a look at November to December. Again, very little change, and so that was reflected as well, and the no change in pipe versus rail as far as crude oil movements
out of the region. Slide 5 is just the estimates of rail transportation out of the region. And so you can see again with that uptick in crude oil production overall from North Dakota in the region, we did see an uptick in the volumes being moved by both pipeline and rail. So you can see the rail estimates reflected in chart 5 or page 5. The spread, as of this was yesterday afternoon, so that has widened slightly from what we saw in December and then January. Now right around that $5 to $6 spread between Brent and WTI. I don't know that that's enough to make any significant changes, at least in the near term, for how that crude oil ends up leaving North Dakota. And so one of the other dynamics that we will have going forward, the Highland, the Kinder Morgan is in the process of purchasing Highland, but the Double H pipeline will be in service with an initial capacity of just over 80,000 barrels per day with some firm shipper commitments to that. So we will see a changing dynamic as that system goes into service, and that will be reflected in the coming months of transportation estimates. On the flaring side, we saw a slight decrease in the overall flaring percentage. Just looking at non-confidential information, that decrease was reflected primarily in that blue piece of the pie. So taking a look at the percent of gas that's flared from wells that were not connected to the gas gathering system. So what that is continuing to show, if we would have looked at this pie chart a couple of years ago, it was skewed more towards the wells that weren't connected. And so as these systems are getting built out, they're getting wells connected. And then now the primary challenge to address flaring is to get those existing systems operating so that they can handle all the gas that's being produced in the different regions. And so we're going to continue to see focused efforts, not only on getting wells connected, but trying to address that orange piece of the pie and how can they optimize their systems to move as much gas and process as much gas as possible. And then just keeping up on the connections side, basically even again, which is good news that the gas gathering industry was keeping up with the pace of drilling throughout December. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Go ahead, Emily. Are you concerned that there's a lot of protests happening around the country of pipelines that would carry Bakken crude to refineries? Are you concerned that could impact the ability to export crude from North Dakota through pipelines?
Yeah, so the question was taking a look at some of the interstate pipeline systems and working through those individual state regulatory process for the siting. So taking a look going forward, our expectations are that production is going to continue to rise over the long term. And so that crude oil is going to need to move to market either on a pipeline system or in a rail car. And so the pipeline systems that are in development, Sandpiper is one that transports through Minnesota, Energy Transfer Partners, which goes through North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa on its way to Patoka, Illinois. And so it's going to be important for those projects to get developed, but it's also important for those states to work through their individual regulatory process to make sure that that route works for that state. And so I think long-term pipelines have proven themselves to work very well at moving those liquids over long distances. And so I'm going to continue to work on developing those projects.
And just to follow up, and what about some of the opposition to oil terminals in the Northwest that would offload crude from trains that come from the Bakken? Do you have any thoughts about how that could impact the ability to move oil to market?
The question was on the specific oil terminals in the Pacific Northwest. That I don't have enough details to know how individual projects, whether or not they proceed or if they're delayed, what type of overall impact that would have in North Dakota. So I don't have a whole lot of specifics there. So I don't know if I can give a real definite answer.
Any impacts from the Bridger pipeline being down?
The question was about the Bridger pipeline being down. I have not heard any feedback as to what type of impact that's having. Again, the Bridger pipeline connects into the Butte pipeline at Baker, Montana. And so Baker South on that Butte pipeline, that's still operational. So barrels that traditionally would have been using that Bridger system would either have to be trucked longer distances to get onto either an alternative pipeline to get to Baker, or ultimately maybe having to go on a rail car if they can't gain access anywhere else.
Okay, anyone else?
Sorry, one more. Have you been following any of the federal rulemaking with regard to crude by rail safety? And if so, could you give us an update?
No, the question was on the federal, the DOT standards for tank cars. No, that's not something I'm involved in, so I don't know. I don't have any additional information, I guess.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.